What's going on, Chess YouTube? In today's video, Magnus Carlsen shocks Fabiano Caruana by sacrificing the queen in the 2022 Speed Chess Championships. Now in the game, Magnus opens 1e4, best by test, and Fabiano Caruana goes e5. Then we have knight f3 attacking the pawn, knight c6 defends the pawn, and then 3 bishop b5, the Ruy Lopez opening on the board. Now from here, Fabiano attacks the bishop a6, then bishop a6, knight f6, and castles, all very standard stuff so far. And here Fabiano Caruana, he goes for his favorite Archengelsk variation of the Ruy Lopez with the move b5, bishop b3, and then bishop c5 on the board. Now Fabiano is one of the world's biggest leading experts in the Archengelsk, and the idea is you want to get your bishop on the very active c5 square instead of e7 as in the closed Ruy Lopez. Now here Magnus goes a4, expanding on the queen side and threatening a takes b5 as the rook on the a8 square is undefended and black cannot recapture a takes b5 yet. So with that in mind, Fabiano goes rook b8, defending the pawn on b5 with the rook and stepping out of the pit. Now we have a takes b5 and a takes b5 on the board. And here Magnus, instead of trying to expand in the center with the idea of c3 and d4, that is the main line here, instead Magnus goes d3, a very quiet variation. There's nothing wrong with this, but it's definitely a lot less ambitious. Now here Fabiano goes d6, the standard idea, and now Magnus bishop e3 on the board, challenging that bishop on c5, a very interesting choice. Now Fabiano can take on e3, however if he doesn't, Magnus Carlsen himself will have the option of bishop takes c5. So which one is it going to be? In the game, Fabiano castles, he is not afraid of bishop takes c5, and in the game, Magnus actually does take on c5. So bishop takes and then d takes on the board. And this is a very interesting pawn structure that we have here. Here, Fabiano has those two pawn islands, the queen side pawns and the king side pawns. However, his double pawns on the c file aren't really that weak. That pawn on c5 does clamp down on that d4 square, stopping d4 ideas from white almost permanently. And beyond that, Fabiano does have very good control over this open d-file with the queen and maybe the rook in the future. So here Fabiano is doing just fine and the game is approximately level. Now here Magnus Carlsen, what should his idea be doing? Well, the main idea is going to be knight to c3, trying to jump into the d5 square with the knight or the bishop. However, instead, he actually goes knight d2, the standard Ruy Lopez idea. However, it's not as strong in this kind of pawn structure. Now Fabiano goes queen d6, a very solid idea, activating the queen. And now Magnus h3 on the board, and this move again is a little bit weaker. The idea being you want to stop bishop g4, potentially setting up c3 and d4 ideas, but again, Magnus is already not committing to that plan of c3 and d4, therefore controlling that g4 square and stopping bishop g4 isn't that big of a priority, so h3 a little bit inaccurate. Now h6 for Fabiano Caruana, stopping knight g5 ideas, and then rook e1 for Magnus Carlsen. Now we have rook d8, activating the rook on the semi-open d-file, and then queen to e2 for Magnus getting his last piece into the game. And now here in this position, Fabiano Caruana has an absolutely critical decision to make. How does he want to continue developing? Well, in the game, he goes for an absolutely insane idea, knight to h5. Now this move is maybe a tiny bit inaccurate, but only if Magnus Carlsen understands exactly how to follow up. Instead of this real fast, main idea could have been perhaps queen to e7, just getting the queen off this semi-open d-file, increasing the activity of the rook, and he would be just fine. Instead here, knight to h5 on the board. Now the obvious threat, he wants to go knight to f4, jumping in with the knight, pressuring the queen on e2, and putting pressure on that weak pawn on the h3 square. And that is all well and good. However, there's one problem with this move knight to h5. That knight is undefended, and if Magnus Carlsen jumps in with this knight on f3 to somewhere, he will have a discovered attack with the queen on the knight. And that is exactly what Magnus Carlsen does here. He goes knight to g5, a brilliant move, opening up the discovered attack on the knight, but this move is so much deeper than that. Here, with this move knight g5, Magnus Carlsen, he had to calculate everything out. He is committing full stop to a queen sacrifice. There is no going back. Here, Fabiano Caruana, if he takes on g5, say h takes g5, then queen takes is the move, and his pawn structure on the king side will be damaged. Therefore, Fabiano is forced to go knight to f4, hitting the queen on e2 with tempo. And now, what is Magnus Carlsen going to do? If he moves the queen, let's say queen to e3 or queen to f3, then the move is h takes g5, you literally lose the knight for nothing. So that is not an option. Instead here, Magnus Carlsen, he finds the only good move in this position for white. And it's definitely not bishop takes f7. After king to h8, black again is going to be just fine. He's going to be winning that piece on g5. Instead here, Magnus Carlsen, he jumps in with the knight to the f7 square. Now this looks logical. After all, you are taking the free pawn, opening up the discovered attack with the bishop on the king, and you are hitting the queen with tempo, or so it seems. In this position, black can take on e2 with tempo, hitting the king with check, and that is what Fabiano does. So, knight takes e2 on the board, winning the queen. Now you have to respond. Rook takes e2, and here, Magnus Carlsen in this position, he officially sacrificed his queen. All right, what the heck is going on here? Let's find out. Now, the queen on d6 is being attacked. Fabiano Caruana has to respond to that threat immediately. Where is he going to go with the queen? Well, it turns out almost every square is booby-trapped. For example, if you go to, say, queen to e7, a very logical-looking square, then the idea is knight takes d8 with check, and then you take on c6, forking the queen on e7 and the rook on b8. So here, Fabiano Caruana, he has to find the right square with the queen to stay alive. And in the game, he does just that. He goes queen to f6, not queen to e7. The benefit of f6, he gets the queen out of the attack, he defends the rook on d8, and he defends the knight on the c6 square, and he gets out of the way of future forking ideas by the knight. So, perfect square for the queen. Now Magnus, he takes on d8 with the knight. Knight takes d8, winning the rook. The king goes to h7, good square for the king. And then finally, knight takes c6, queen takes c6. And now the dust has settled. Let's do inventory. Here, Magnus Carlsen, he's up a knight, a pawn, and a rook in return for the queen. And somehow, someway, we have a position with even material where Magnus Carlsen sacrificed the queen. All right, this is going to be a very wild game from here. In the game, Magnus goes c3, trying to give extra space for the bishop. Perhaps he wants to go bishop c2 next. Instead of that, real fast, the main idea would have been a fast bishop d5, getting the bishop to the very strong d5 square with tempo, hitting the queen on c6. Instead, c3 on the board, and now Fabiano punishes this move with the move c4. Very accurate, trying to drive back that bishop. Now, real fast, you may be wondering, what if Magnus Carlsen just takes on c4 twice with the pawn, then the bishop or the knight? Well, the problem with that is the rook on the b8 square will have the attack on that pawn on b2. That would be excellent for Fabiano Caruana. So Magnus, he has to find the right response here. The best move is actually bishop c2, intending c takes d3, and then bishop takes d3, trying to keep these files closed. Instead here, Magnus does take on c4, d takes c4, then b takes, and then here, instead of, say, bishop takes c4, he actually goes bishop to a4, hitting the queen with tempo on c6, and therefore giving himself enough time to defend the pawn on the b2 square. So, queen g6 on the board, a very strong move by Fabiano Caruana. Now the threat is bishop takes h3, winning the pawn, as that pawn on g2 will be pinned to the king by the queen on g6. So now Magnus, how does he respond to that threat? Well, it turns out he doesn't. He takes on c4 with the knight. Knight takes c4, defending the pawn on b2 with the knight and the rook, and also threatening knight takes e5 in the future, but giving up that pawn on h3 in the process. So, bishop takes h3 on the board, and the audacity of Fabiano Caruana in this position, threatening checkmate in one move. Magnus Carlsen has to respond to this threat. And in the game, he just goes knight to e3, a very strong idea, defending that weak g2 point with the knight without making any more weakening pawn moves on the king side. Now we have bishop to e6, retreating the bishop, getting out of the way of future attacks on that bishop. And now b4 for Magnus Carlsen, defending the pawn on b2, and also getting his pawns rolling on the queen side. Of course, Magnus has that queenside pawn majority, those two pawns versus the one of Fabiano, and therefore pushing those pawns down the board is going to be his main priority here. All right, what should Fabiano be doing here? Well, in the game, he finds a very strong idea. Rook to d8, activating the rook on this open d file. Of course, the rook doing very, very little on b8 now that Magnus did play b4. Therefore, d8, the better square for the rook. But now Magnus, he is not amused. He goes rook d1, offering the rook trade and challenging Fabiano's rook on d8. Now, this is a very good idea. When you have two rooks and your opponent only has one, it's almost always a good idea to trade off one pair of rooks. That way, you are the only person with that type of piece in the position left. So here, rook takes and then bishop takes on the board. The rooks are flying off, and Magnus is the only person with the rook left, and the material is still even in this insane position. All right, h5 on the board. Fabiano Caruana channeling alpha zero energy. He wants to go h5, then h4, then h3, trying to blow open the king side. The audacity of this man. All right, rook d2 on the board, activating the rook on the open d file. Then h4 as expected. Now bishop e2 for Magnus Carlsen. And now instead of the immediate h3, here Fabiano goes queen to g5, a very interesting idea, trying to pin the knight on e3 to the rook on d2. Now, if you go, say, knight to f5 or knight d5, that rook on the d2 square will fall to the queen. So, very clever idea by Fabiano in this blitz game. Now, bishop c4 on the board, offering the trade of bishops. If Fabiano takes, say, bishop takes, then there was knight takes c4, and suddenly the knight is defending the rook on d2, and Magnus will be okay, and that is what happens. Bishop takes, and then knight takes on the board, and here again, despite the trades, we do have even material. Magnus Carlsen having that extra pawn on the queen side, the knight and the rook versus the queen of Fabiano Caruana. All right, now, Fabiano, he goes for it on the king side, h3, threatening checkmate in one move with the move queen takes g2. Obviously, Magnus is going to have to respond to that threat. However, real fast, this move may have been premature. Instead, queen to f4 may have been a little bit stronger, trying to put pressure on that very weak pawn on the e5 square. Now instead, h3 on the board, and then knight to e3 for Magnus Carlsen, again defending that weak g2 point with the knight in this game. All right, now we have h takes g2, Fabiano temporarily winning a pawn. Of course, knight takes g2 is not a possibility, as that would hang the rook on d2, and king takes g2 is not a legal move, as the queen controls the g2 square. All right, rook d7 on the board for Magnus. A very, very strong idea, threatening the pawn on c7 and eyeing the weak pawn on g7. And Magnus may even have rook takes g7 ideas in the future. Hint, hint, wink, wink. All right, here, Fabiano. Queen to h4 on the board. A very strong idea, threatening both the pawn on e4 and queen to h1. That would be checkmate. So Magnus, what is he going to do about it? Well, it turns out he has an unbelievable tactical shot in this position. If you like puzzles, pause the video right now and try to find the tactical shot for Magnus Carlsen in this position. And while you're at it, if you're enjoying this video, go ahead and smash that YouTube like button for me. Thank you so much for hitting the YouTube like button. It helps so much. All right, the key idea for Magnus Carlsen in this position, believe it or not, is the rook sacrifice, or the temporary one. Rook takes g7. That would be a brilliant move. The idea being, if the king takes, then you go knight to f5, forking the king and the queen, winning on the spot. So, after rook takes, the king has to move, say king to h8, and then you go rook takes g2, winning the pawn with the rook, and from there, Magnus would have a very stable advantage. Instead, he goes knight takes g2 in this position, missing the idea of rook takes g7 in time pressure. Now we have queen takes e4, Fabiano Caruana winning a pawn, but Magnus does the same. Rook takes c7 on the board, and now Magnus has those two protected pass pawns on the queen side. Again, his main idea is pushing those pawns down the board as fast as he can. Now queen d3 on the board, eyeing that c3 pawn, and Magnus just goes knight to e3, centralizing the knight, getting it to a very strong square. Now king g6, rook c5, pressuring e5, and king to g5 on the board. Fabiano Caruana, instead of defending e5 with the king or the queen, his plan is just to march the king down the board and maybe even try to checkmate Magnus Carlsen. Very interesting idea. All right, rook takes e5, the obvious move, and then king to f4. The king march has begun. All right, rook to f5 hits the king, the rook being defended by the knight on e3, and now king to e4. The king march continues. All right, c4 on the board for Magnus Carlsen. He is pushing those pawns down the board. He is playing for a win. Now queen to b1 hits the king and that pawn on b4. So the king has to move. King g2, then queen takes b4. Fabiano Caruana equalizing the game, equalizing the material balance. Now rook to f4 hits the king. King to d3. Of course, you cannot take that rook on f4. For example, king takes f4 will be met by knight to d5, forking the king and the queen. That will be game over on the spot. So, rook to f4, very clever idea. The king cannot take. It has to go, say, to the d3 square or somewhere else. Now, rook g4, pressuring the pawn on g7, Fabiano Caruana. And now, Fabiano, queen to b7, defends the pawn and hits the king with check. Magnus Carlsen, knight d5, blocking the check, putting the knight on a very strong square, and of course that pawn on c4 still being defended by the rook for right now. All right, king to e2 for Fabiano Caruana. The king march continues. Now rook to e4 check, king d3 and f3 defends the rook on the e4 square. Now queen b2 check hits the king, king to g3 on the board, then queen to b1, setting up more threats potentially with a king move, say anywhere else, king d2 with a discovered attack by the queen on the rook. Now knight to f4 hits the king, king d2, and then knight to e6, pressuring that pawn on g7. If that pawn falls, then Magnus Carlsen is going to be one step closer to sealing the deal and winning the game here. All right, Fabiano, he cannot allow that. queen to g1 on the board, hits the king, and defends the pawn with the x-ray attack. Now, king to f4, queen to g6, pressures the knight, king to e5, and here Fabiano, he has to find the right idea in this position to hang on. All right, the key idea here for Fabiano is going to be queen to f6, the very important check on the f6 square. Instead, he actually goes king to c3 in this position, and now Magnus Carlsen, he starts to run away with the game. c5, expanding on the queen side. Again, if he can just push that pawn down the board, that is going to be his path to victory. Now, queen to h5 on the board for Fabiano, another slight mistake. Instead, queen to e8 was necessary, pinning the knight to the king and trying to get the queen closer to the queen side where it can defend against that pawn. Instead, queen to h5 on the board, again a slightly weaker move, and now Magnus Carlsen, he is the one doing the king march. King d6 on the board, the king is in a position to escort that pawn down to the c8 square. All right, queen takes f3, wins a pawn. Fabiano Caruana is up material now. However, that pawn on c5 is the most important piece in the position. Again, Magnus is threatening to just push it down the board. All right, rook to e5 on the board for Magnus, a slightly inaccurate move. Instead, rook to d4 would have been the right idea. Instead, rook to e5 on the board, and now queen d3 check hits the king. All right, rook d5 blocks the check, and then queen to a6 hits the king again, a slight inaccuracy. Instead, queen to g3, believe it or not, was the right idea. Instead, queen to a6 on the board, and now Magnus, he pushes his pawn to c6. c6 on the board, blocking the check. He is one step closer to victory. But now Fabiano Caruana, he is not going down without a fight. He expands on the king side with the move g5, a deflection move, trying to break up the coordination of the white pieces. And if you don't take it, then g4 will be the move, and then Fabiano will be playing for a win. So, rook takes g5 on the board, distracting the rook, and now king c4, marching in with the king once again. Now rook c5, king b4, and knight c7 hits the queen on the c6 on the a6 square. Now, according to my database, in this position, Fabiano Caruana actually gave up the queen on the a6 square. He went king to b3, simply giving up the queen, and Magnus Carlsen did not take the queen. He went knight to d5. Again, I don't believe these moves. I think it must have been some sort of error in transmission with the moves in the database. If you know what the real moves were right here, let me know in the comment section below. I would love to know that information. But instead, the game continues. Now king to b2, and I assume from here on out, these are all of the accurate moves. All right, king d7 for Magnus Carlsen. Queen to a7 hits the king, then king to d6. Now queen to a6 on the board for Fabiano, repeating moves, and rook to c3. The rook on a very surprising square where it is defended by the knight on the d5 square. All right, king b1 on the board, rook b3, king c1, and then rook b6, pressuring the queen on the a6 square. Now queen to a3 hits the king, rook b4 blocks the check, queen to d3, and here Magnus Carlsen, he spots it is time to push that pawn one step closer to promoting c7 on the board. And is there anything Fabiano Caruana can do in this position to stop that pawn? Let's find out. Queen g3 on the board, hitting the king. Now king c6, queen g8, controlling the queen square. Now a c8, queen takes c8 would equalize the game on the spot. He might even be playing for a win. But instead, here, Magnus Carlsen, rook to b8, controlling the back rank with the rook, a very impressive move. Now queen to e6 hits the king, and one final move from Magnus Carlsen seals the deal. King to c5, a brilliant move. Now there are no more checks with the queen. For example, e7 is controlled by the knight, as is e3. There is simply no way to check the king, and there is no way to stop the idea of c8 promoting to a new queen. And for that reason, in this position, on move 71, Fabiano Caruana resigns on the spot to Magnus Carlsen and his unbelievable queen sacrifice from this game. Wow, what a game by Magnus and Fabiano Caruana. All right, Chess YouTube, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, smash that like button. And while you're at it, check out this video right here, where the Indian superstar Pragnananda sacrifices 2 rooks in the opening against Magnus Carlsen. Again, there are 2 rook sacrifices in that game. You're going to love it. So check it out, and I'll see you in the next video.